I'm Meredith Cooper, 27, and I'm standing in a hotel ballroom as Dad lifts his glass for the father of the bride toast. Nate Collins, the process server, walks toward him with an envelope stamped by the court. James Abbott, the officiant, watches me set one heavy envelope on the sweetheart table and doesn't reach for his pen. Grace Cooper, my sister, stares as I tap my phone one code and the room hums with buzzing notifications. Rick Barnes, my dad's oldest friend, goes rigid when he sees the first page sliding out with his notarized signature. Evan Price, my sister's fiancé, and Robert Price, his father, both red and go pale. Karen Price, his mother, whispers to the officiant. He lowers the license. I don't raise my voice. I don't need to. Before I tell you everything that led up to this moment and how I made my family regret humiliating me, tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more first-person family revenge stories. Growing up, Grace arrived like a finished product and gathered applause. She was the loudest answer to every question Dad asked. First pick for teams, first to perform, first to get rescuing hands when something went wrong. Grace's victories came wrapped in stories he told again and again to anyone who would listen. My victories were practical, steady grades, reliable carpool runs, a quiet compliance that let the household run on schedule. Dad called me steady the way some people hand out labels. It sounded like praise, but it was a verb. Be steady, keep the system humming, don't create scenes. When Grace and I shared a room, her trophies lined both dressers as if space itself honored her. My medals, the few I earned, lived in a shoebox under the bed. If I asked for help with something that looked like fuss, a scholarship form, a college interview, Dad would pat my shoulder and say, "You're the strong one, Meredith, don't make this harder." What he meant was, handle it so no one else has to. I learned to read the household like weather. I learned which words diffused tension and which silences fed it. I learned to disappear when praise wandered the house. Absence was a currency I traded for peace. Holidays became productions where Grace was center stage and I kept the lights on. If a guest needed navigating, I handled it. If a recipe was missing an ingredient, I drove across town for it without complaint. People praised Dad for his family-first speeches. He meant family that reflected well on him. Grace fit that image, I fit the backstage. My role was useful, and usefulness made me invisible in the exact way that protected the family's image. Mom ironed the story flat so there weren't wrinkles for anyone else to see. She smoothed explanations and rewrapped favors into lessons about gratitude. Your sister is sensitive, she'd say when Grace demanded attention, then look at me with the quiet hope that I'd manage the fallout. When money tightened, Mom quietly canceled my lessons and insisted Grace's private coaching was non-negotiable. Hand-me-downs came with stories. "This used to be a treasure of mine," she would say, folding the fabric as if memory could make something new. I was taught to be grateful for what remained because gratitude to Mom was maturity. She used language like a soft lever. "I'm counting on you," she'd say, and the sentence clicked into motion like a well-oiled hinge. It wasn't affection. It was instruction. Mom's every calming sentence aligned with Dad's priorities. She brokered peace by giving me away in quiet ways, my extracurriculars quietly sacrificed, my time reallocated to make room for Grace's celebrations. I accepted the bargains because I believed in keeping the family calm and whole. Looking back, those bargains were transactions where my name was payment. Mom socialized with Rick Barnes, passing him notes with half-sentences that hovered and died. He showed up for Grace with last-minute tickets and flashy congratulations, the kind of gestures that read like evidence in a testimony about who mattered. For my small achievements, Rick offered apologies or absent claps. The exchange of glances between Mom and him carried a language of omission. They folded truths into gestures and silence. Mom would smooth the edges of argument with an extra casserole or a private explanation, and I learned that peace sometimes required my quiet resignation. That was the domestic architecture. Mom kept stories tidy and I kept my mouth shut. Dad set up education accounts for Grace and me when we were kids, a proud line he liked to repeat at church and at work. He spoke of investment and future in a way that sounded like protection. When guidance counselors suggested I apply farther away for better programs, Dad preferred I stay sensible and consider community college. He nodded at my scholarship letters with a distracted pride and then later would suggest funds be reallocated for other family needs. I learned the financial terms Dad used: custodian, beneficiary, disbursement, but those words never translated into transparency for me. I kept a private notebook with dates and numbers because words were unreliable. When Grace needed a deposit moved earlier or when Dad wanted a vendor upgraded for business optics, I circled dates and balances in ink. The accounts were nominally for both of us, but the ledger read like a map of who deserved early access. Dad framed his decisions as practical stewardship. He promised, "You'll get your turn." In the same breath, he announced Grace's piano scholarships and summer programs with fanfare. The promise of a future turned into a pattern of postponement until it became a justification for handing my resources to someone else. Love in our house sounded like logistics. It arrived as lists, rides, deadlines met. Compliments were practical bookmarks, good job as preface to another task. Conflict resolution meant I was the first to apologize. Saying sorry removed the problem much faster than arguing ever would. When guests praised Dad's family, they praised the output: perfect photos, job titles, Grace on stage. I was the invisible mechanic who kept those outputs functional. Affection measured as utility taught me to measure myself the same way. I learned to store my softness because softness got in the way. Wanting something for myself felt indulgent. I prioritized plans over celebration, structure over surprise, because structure protected me from the unpredictability that made me vulnerable. I kept literal receipts in a little envelope for small purchases and emotional receipts in a private file: emails saved, screenshots, calendar entries, because I knew words could be reshaped later. Those records became an inheritance of evidence I would one day need. Early relationships repeated the family script: partners who liked my reliability more than my voice, who took the role of mentor or manager and left me holding the to-do list. Then came Jason Reed, my ex-fiancé, who looked like different. Jason Reed, my ex-fiancé, was attentive in ways that felt new. He noticed small things, laughed easily, asked my opinion. He admired my competence. At first that felt like appreciation, not another job. But over time, his admiration for my organization became an expectation that I carry the emotional load while he learned the metrics of how to provide. Jason began meeting with Dad about finances and decision-making as if I were background color. He joked about letting the pros handle big checks and started deferring to Dad's authority on matters that mattered to us both. When I pushed back, Jason told me I was stressed or overreacting. He offered to let Dad feel generous, which I later realized was a veneer for control. The first red flags were small: missed conversations, decisions made without me, my voice treated like a suggestion box. Each time I swallowed it, I was teaching him and my family that my absence in the room was acceptable. Uncle Rick was never far from Dad at those events, laughing in the right places, offering anecdotes that reinforced Dad's narrative. He played his role with practiced ease, the reliable side character in the background of every good story. I learned to anticipate Rick's lines because they'd been told before in slightly different words at church luncheons and industry gatherings. My job was to make sure nothing distracted from the tale they wanted to sell. Success, unity, and a flawless daughter in the center of it all. I handled the backstage work, sending reminder texts, arranging rides, ironing dresses, and making sure RSVPs matched the headcount Dad liked to quote. People complimented Dad on his close family and didn't see the scaffolding that held that image. I would notice a misplaced program and fix it before anyone else noticed. I would smooth a snapped ribbon with my fingers, breathe to hide the irritation, and rehearse my smile. My competence became our secret infrastructure. It made their performance possible and kept my own needs unspoken. We didn't talk about cracks. We talked about impressions. When someone asked how we did it, Dad would smile and say something about values. I understood values as an instruction manual. Always align with the brand, never expose the backstage, prioritize the flagship. I learned to read a room the second I entered and to preempt problems so praise could follow. That skill felt like armor, practical and protective, until it became the thing that masked who I was. The more invisible I made myself, the more the world assumed invisibility was natural for me. I wanted marriage because I wanted to be seen outside of that script. I wanted a place where choices and promises would include me, not just the rolling maintenance of someone else's good story. I didn't imagine a fairy tale with ball gowns and fireworks. I imagined a record that explicitly named me as a person with needs. I wanted vows that acknowledged my history of doing the heavy lifting, vows that promised a partner would notice the quiet things and not take them for granted. The dress, the venue, the cake, they were symbols, shorthand for finally being chosen rather than useful. Planning a wedding felt like asking for a single public declaration that I mattered. I pictured a day without the background hum of errands, without the constant mental ledger of who owed what. I imagined standing in a room where people watched me and heard my name said with care, not just as an adjunct to Dad's achievements. That hope was small but dangerous because it taught me to expect reciprocity for the first time. I allowed myself practical dreams, a modest venue, good food, a few close friends, a ceremony that looked like the life I wanted to build. Those were not extravagant things, they were evidence of being acknowledged. When Dad offered to contribute, it sounded like recognition. He used the word generous and I leaned on it. For the first time, I entertained the idea that someone in my family might put my interest first without strings. That sliver of possibility felt like healing. I started to plan as though the center could finally be me. Each vendor call, each tasting felt like a small vote in favor of being visible. I let myself hope because hope is how you test whether a promise is real. That willingness to hope is what made what came next hurt so much deeper. I had lived most of my life practicing endurance instead of enforcement. Endurance had become my reflex. I could tolerate slights, absorb sideways comments, and keep moving. But endurance is not the same as holding a line. I had skills that could have been used to create boundaries, researching, documenting, timing, but those talents had been deployed to protect the household image, to put out fires for other people's comfort. I did what was expected because I believed loyalty meant sacrifice. That belief taught my family I would always be the scaffolding. I should have learned to mark lines sooner. I should have practiced saying no in small ways before the costs grew larger. Each swallowed rebuke became a lesson for them. Push here and she'll take it. I thought silence was classy, that dignity required mute suffering. It wasn't dignity. It was training. Seeing things clearly, I realized I didn't need a second chance at being loud. I needed a clean exit from the role they'd made for me and the precise tools to keep them from pulling me back. I began reshaping myself into someone who could enforce. That didn't mean I wanted to become cruel. It meant deciding to translate endurance into strategy. I cataloged grudges not to hold them but to record them. I learned to let procedural steps carry my reactions, emails, documented requests, timestamps, rather than emotional pleading. I told myself I wasn't giving up on family, I was stopping the unpaid labor they had normalized. When the last dismissal happened, something else clicked. I would not apologize for wanting an equitable place at the table. Early in planning, Grace began helping in ways that quietly redirected the whole event. She would forward dress links with a breathless, "Imagine me in this," and the images would shift conversations at fittings. Dinners turned into planning sessions where her suggestions earned immediate interest. Dad offered vendor names with the same exuberant emphasis as a man recommending a stock tip. He framed changes as updates for the bigger picture, and people took him at his word because he spoke like a man used to getting results. Jason deferred to Dad in conversations about budgets and guest lists, often cutting me out of the loop by scheduling calls I couldn't attend. He praised Dad's experience like a mantra, and when I pushed back, he called me stressed. Mom hovered in the middle, giving calming lines to both sides and offering small compromises that always ended with me adjusting. Avery, the planner, began asking whether decisions were final, as if searching for confirmation from beyond me. Small shifts accumulated. My florist suggestions were politely set aside, my playlist was borrowed for Grace's brunch, and my cake design was used as a template for a layered upgrade. These shifts were never presented as hostile. They arrived as favors, ideas, and the kind of help you don't refuse when it comes from a parent. I found myself apologizing for asking clarity. The planner would check with Grace as if it was natural that Grace held the veto. My calls started to get shorter, my tasks became compliance checks. What should have been a shared project turned into a live demonstration of who had influence and who had to keep quiet. Money turned into the leash that kept me walking where they wanted. Dad insisted invoices be routed through him with a friendly explanation about vendor relationships and discounts. "It'll be smoother if I manage the deposits," he said, folding his control into the language of service. He framed upgrades as generosity. "I'll cover some of the extra costs," he'd say, and suddenly decisions shifted in his favor. When he volunteered to improve the venue or enhance the cake, it came with an unspoken expectation that I would accept the change and its optics. I asked for a cap on spending and was met with a chuckle and talk of negative thinking. When I raised concerns, Jason would suggest letting Dad feel generous, interpreting manipulation as benevolence. He didn't see that the offer of money was a conditional act, it bought the right to redraw plans. I started tracking whose name was on each contract and who had made which deposit. That ledger became my map of leverage. The more invoices went through Dad, the less autonomy I had. Dad attached conditions to every gift. He proposed a $20,000 addition as a course correction for the reception and called it an investment in the family brand. The cash came in the same tone as his other decisions, framed as kindness, delivered with the expectation of deference. I realized generosity came with an expiration date. Once accepted, it could be redirected to someone else without much protest. Control disguised as largesse was the most effective leash of all. It bought silence and a space in which they could reassign my dreams to someone more useful to the story they wanted to tell. Evan's parents, Robert and Karen Price, arrived at dinner like guests evaluating a product. They were polite, practiced, and precise. They asked about Dad's work and mentioned church affiliations with approval. Grace began to borrow from my plans with a casualness that felt like erasure. "Mind if I use your playlist for the engagement party?" she'd ask, as if what I curated for months was an accessory she could borrow. She wanted my florist, my dessert layout, even a color swatch I'd been saving. "Moms, be a team," nudged me toward sharing. The word team in our house always meant someone else's gain disguised as mutual effort. The overlap grew like a stain, my choices eroded into her celebration, and I watched pieces of my wedding become rehearsals for hers. At first I told myself grace and generosity were family values. Then I started noticing how quickly those values turned into assumptions. Each time Grace suggested borrowing, it shifted expectation and made my plans provisional. Dad treated the new engagement as an opportunity to align both events for efficiency. He spoke like someone mapping an operation. I felt my options narrowing, and the narrowing felt deliberate, as if momentum would soon carry my day right out of sight. I could almost hear the gears clicking, the backstage I'd always run changing blueprints without my input. Jason began to change in a way I should have noticed earlier, but hope is a stubborn lens. At first his alignment with Dad felt like a son-in-law learning the ropes, later it read like allegiance. He started taking calls with Dad about guest lists and finances, scheduling them at times when I couldn't join. He'd come home and summarize with a casual, "He suggested we," as if the suggestion required no discussion. He admired Dad's experience like it was a manual, and he started following it. When I pushed back about seating or deposits, Jason would sigh and call me stressed, a label that shut down conversation without addressing my point. He framed my concerns as temperament, not substance. Those afternoons Dad spent with Jason felt like training sessions. Jason took notes, asked about business contacts, and started offering me practical solutions that always leaned toward Dad's preferences. It was subtle reprogramming. I was no longer the partner in planning, I became a shared project between the men. He began to echo Dad's language in conversations about generosity and optics. I noticed the way he smiled when Dad emphasized doing it right, a smile that meant acceptance of a hierarchy. Watching him shift allegiance was like seeing a trusted mirror crack. The reflection changed, and I was slow to register why the pieces no longer matched. Testing my compliance was an art form in our house, small, harmless-looking things that slowly realigned the floor beneath me. The cake tasting mistake arrived as a clerical mix-up. Avery had scheduled a tasting for a flavor Grace loved, and by the time I figured it out at checkout, the order had been noted as a default. When I brought it up, Dad chuckled and said, "We're just seeing what works," and Jason shrugged as if bakery choices were not worth a debate. My dress fitting got rescheduled with the kind of calendar conflict language that treated my appointments as negotiable. I walked into the boutique on a day that prioritized Grace's trial and watched my seamstress apologize as if it had been my oversight. The planner floated minor changes that always matched Grace's Pinterest boards. "No big deal," they'd say when a centerpiece shifted toward rose gold or when napkin colors changed to match a palette Grace preferred. They asked Grace's opinion like she was the decision point, not an equal voice among many. When I asked why these decisions were being made without consultation, Dad called me dramatic. Jason told me I sounded tired. Those small dismissals became the pattern. Some administrative error here, a misfiled email there, each one biasing arrangements toward Grace. I began to track every mistake in my ledger: dates, email headers, the time a call was scheduled, and who answered. The pattern wasn't random, it was a sequence. The meeting before the blow, the final menu tasting, was presented to me as a formality, a box to tick. Dad insisted on sitting at the head of the table and positioned Grace and Evan next to him like favored officers. The Larkspur's room smelled of lemon and linen, the air conditioning hummed like a third presence. Avery checked in with Grace for final approvals as if the baton had already passed. Robert and Karen sat like adjudicators, folding napkins with careful hands, watching with the polite attention of people vetting a partnership. Uncle Rick arrived late and planted himself in Dad's orbit, the way he always did. I was seated between Mom and Jason, the pacification zone, my place designed to keep the peace rather than be the center of any decision. Avery's questions were small measures of power. "Do we want the plated option or family style? Which linens?" Each time she looked to Grace, a tiny transfer happened. The planner's pen hovered over checkboxes, and the room translated that pause into authority. I felt an old, practiced instinct in my limbs: catalog, note, respond, but this time I cataloged with a different intention. I watched for who deferred to whom, which invoices were noted as deposits, which vendor names were repeated with approval. The conversation had the low, civilized tone of a professional meeting, but the subtext was domestic real estate: who would own the look and who would be left to tidy it up. By the time Dad began to speak, the room had a soft current of expectation. People had come to watch a man manage details, to see his sense of order perform. He sat a little straighter, speaking in a way that drew people's attention the way a conductor draws a pause. In the days leading to the tasting, I kept imagining the final line we all would cross when private preference became public authority. The meeting felt like the last checkpoint before a takeover, a curated moment where words could become decree. I breathed through the restlessness and set my face to neutrality, ready because neutrality was the only defense that wouldn't be mistaken for hysteria. The guardrails that had preserved a civil veneer began to slide off in small ways that day, like a tablecloth being pulled too quickly. Dad's tone shifted from performative to declarative. He stopped speaking as a host and started speaking as an owner. His eyes cut through small talk and found me like a compass needle finding metal. He started making jabs that landed not as jokes but as markers. Some people aren't built for responsibility, he said, as casually as someone discussing the weather, and the sentence was launched toward my career the way a dart finds its target. Avery asked a practical question about linens since we're aligning both events, and there it was, not a slip but a plan. Jason laughed at Dad's rougher jokes, the kind that frame someone as being difficult. His hand reached for mine as if to soothe, but the gesture came too late and looked routine. Mom's eyes darted to me with that old plea, please. She thought my stillness would avert the crisis. Uncle Rick kept his gaze on the tablecloth, complicit in the old arrangement. The room that day felt less like a planning session and more like the opening act of a play where I had been cast as a problem. People moved in predictable ways, and I mapped those movements like coordinates. If a pattern exists, it's easier to predict where a swing will land. That afternoon, the public guardrails fell away because the private rules had been rewritten in whispers for a long time. Decisions piled in my name until my name meant permission. I kept quiet then because silence had always been my training, but in the quiet I was taking notes, noting the time a voice shifted, the exact phrase someone used, and how people leaned when Dad spoke. The air tasted of lemon and tension, and I stored the sensory details like evidence. I learned something in those minutes. When a household exhausts polite forms, it reveals its posture. And that posture was what I would one day hold accountable. I felt my pulse in the small bones of my hands. The Larkspur room buzzed with air conditioning and wine, the light hitting the tablecloths in a thin silver. Uncle Rick leaned forward in his chair the way a man leans into a secret. Mom's mouth made a small plead please without sound. I leveled my breathing and imagined each inhale as a tick on a clock. If humiliation was the currency Dad wanted to spend, then I would let him spend it and count the coins out loud when I was ready. There was an ease to his cruelty that came from rehearsing it on smaller scenes until it felt natural in public. He had built a pattern of escalation, minor slights, a public joke, a shift in the plan, then a public decree. That day he chose the decree. I watched him load the final straw with a composed face, one I would later remember like a photograph. He had decided the story did not need me as a protagonist and prepared the audience to accept the edit. He rose, glass in hand, and the room shifted forward like people leaning into a play's climax. I felt everyone's attention become a heat against my skin. I kept my hands on my lap, shoulders even, and let the moment compress. I had practiced for indignity. I had not yet practiced for the particular currency of being erased in front of people whose approval mattered. The thing about a practiced man of power is he believes the performance absolves him. That belief was about to meet a different kind of preparation. Dad tapped his glass and said, "I'm not paying for this clown show." His voice carried without strain the sort of flat announcement that invited laughter at someone else's expense. He pointed at Jason and called him a freeloader in a tone that read more like a verdict than a complaint. "Take him out," he said to Avery, as if orders about people took the same form as orders about linens. Then he told the planner to cancel the orders and to transfer the venue, the cake design, and the dress order to Grace. He named a figure, a $20,000 cash gift, and said it would be redirected to Grace as a course correction. He named me as the problem in one slow string of words and declared I was uninvited from my own reception. He leaned into the sentence as if he were placing a crown on the rightful heir. Jason stood because he was a man of action in the moment of confrontation and because Dad had made a display that required someone to move. He walked toward the exit with the kind of heavy, measured steps I would later catalog as evidence of choice. The room went quiet, like a place holding its breath, as if people were waiting to see whether the story would tip into farce or tragedy. Avery, the planner, looked to Grace for confirmation. Grace nodded once, a small, tight motion that read like agreement and not mercy. Robert and Karen Price exchanged a glance that said they liked decisiveness even when it was cold. Uncle Rick kept his eyes on the table, the practiced friend who had always placed loyalty above questions. Mom whispered, "Please don't make this worse." Her voice was too small for the ballroom, and she seemed to believe that my stillness would prevent the situation from exploding further. The staff hushed in place. A server with a tray stopped mid-step, the corkscrew was left half-turned. Nearby tables turned their heads the way neighborhoods face a sudden argument in the street. I catalogued every face and the exact phrasing Dad used. I noted Avery's hesitation, the way she tucked her notepad under her arm like a shield. I registered Robert's tightened jaw and Corinne's hand to her mouth, a reflexive, concerned geometry. Every reaction became a line item in my head, a ledger of witness and tone. I didn't argue. I asked for copies of the invoices and stood because documentation mattered more than a plea. I told Avery I appreciated her time and shook Robert's hand with the sort of precision that communicates both civility and departure. I left without looking at Dad. Outside, the air felt colder, metallic with the hotel's exterior lights and the hum of passing traffic. I sat on a step just beyond the entrance and texted myself a time-stamped summary, brief, factual sentences, so there would be a contemporaneous record of what had happened. I let Jason walk away without asking for an explanation. His leaving was data. He had chosen Dad's validation over our partnership. I cried later, alone in my apartment, in the privacy of the bathroom where the water beat a steady rhythm against the tiles and hid any sound. After the crying, I wrote a list on a legal pad titled, "Control the Story." It began with a single instruction, do not be reactive, and then expanded into tasks, names, dates, and potential leverage points. Crying was a release. The list was a plan. I had been practicing endurance my whole life, and now I would practice consequence. First, I stabilized things I controlled and contained the damage Dad had tried to do. I froze shared wedding accounts and changed passwords on anything in my name that could be redirected. I canceled auto payments that were routed through Dad and requested direct statements from vendors because control often hides in the billing. I archived correspondence and made copies in multiple places, digital folders with timestamps, printed packets in a locked drawer so that any attempt to rewrite the past would meet a record. I ended my engagement with Jason by email, concise, dated, and courteous. I documented that choice because in a family that lives by optics, documentation is a kind of defense. I scheduled therapy to keep my affect even. Therapy was practical as much as it was emotional. I needed a steady cognitive baseline so I could operate without reactive heat. I told Mom I needed space. She tried to broker peace the way she always had, softly, urgently, but I steered the conversation toward boundaries rather than reconciliation. I would not accept token apologies without accountability. I created a daily 30-day plan with tasks laid out in bullets: collect documents, contact an attorney, secure lab options, speak to witnesses. Each day had a check, and each check had a next step. Emotion became a variable I logged, not the driver of the work. Then I mapped leverage and targets with the sort of crispness I'd used in planning a schedule or an event. I listed Dad's sensitivities. The church elders who admired his steady hand, his business partners who valued his reputation, and the public narrative he had built for years. I noted Grace's dependencies. Dad's money, Evan's parents' perception, and the way she leaned on public approval for validation. I identified Uncle Rick's single point of vulnerability, a long-buried secret that linked him directly to the family story. I sketched legal avenues, trust structures, the education fund's custodial rules, possible emergency injunctions, and marked which ones could be triggered with documentation. I defined what a win looked like. Public accountability that couldn't be shrugged off, financial freezes that prevented further reallocation, and a clean exit for me with the letter of the law on my side. I set one rule: no confrontation without consequence. No shouted argument in a restaurant that might be spun into melodrama, no leaks to gossip that would dilute impact. I would move with the procedural calm of someone arranging a legal closing, not the chaotic heat of an argument. The list concretized my intention and turned hurt into process. For Dad, I needed something he had touched and then thrown away. I took advantage of a weekend visit to his office, routine, unremarkable, and found a coffee cup left in a trash bin near the desk. It had lipstick on the rim and his fingerprints in the dried coffee. I wore gloves, turned it into a brown paper bag, wrote the timestamp, and put that bag with Grace's hair. Chain of custody matters in routine ways, who handled what when. I logged every move in a document I stored on an encrypted hard drive I kept at a friend's apartment. I paid the private lab with a prepaid card, not with an account connected to me, to avoid creating a thread back to my home. I picked a reputable lab that did kinship analysis with attorney oversight. The lab's turnaround time was a week for basic markers and slightly longer for a full report. I set up the drop-off under an alias and arranged delivery to a PO box I'd opened the month before. Olivia, my attorney, advised on wording and handling. She told me to treat the results like a court exhibit, not a confrontation starter. When the results came, they included charts and probabilities and a clear statement about relatedness. I printed them in full color and had them bound in a single packet. The packet would be one part of a public narrative. The hair and cup were the quiet proof that made the story hard to dismiss. Getting Uncle Rick's confession required a different approach. I arranged a meeting during the slow hour at a diner he liked to visit. No witnesses, no loud radio, just the hum of a coffee pot and a late lunch crowd. I brought a typed declaration that stated facts simply and left out anything sounding like accusation. It read like a script for memory, dates, events, relationships. I showed him the lab timeline and made it clear that what I wanted was his notarized statement acknowledging paternity of Grace. I gave him an out that promised no criminal charges, only the truth recorded in a legal form. Fear and relief are a strange mix. He asked me if Dad would ever know it was me. I told him truth tends to find its path. I had a mobile notary on standby. I knew men like Rick, old friends who thought they could manage a secret until it became too expensive to carry. When he finally signed, he did it with shaking hands. The notary stamped and witnessed the signature, and I made 2 photocopies. One copy went into the packet with the lab report. Another I kept with Olivia. Rick's handwriting looked smaller than I expected on paper that meant everything. I recorded the meeting time, the server's name, and the diner's address in the same encrypted drive. The confession wasn't theatrical, it was legal. It turned gossip into a sworn statement. Olivia dug into the education fund with an efficient, clinical curiosity. She explained the basics without excess. Dad had acted as custodian of a family education account created when we were children. That gave him administrative control but did not give him free rein to reassign funds without accounting. If the fund's rules were being bent, a court could freeze transfers and demand a full accounting. She suggested filing an emergency motion to freeze the remainder of the fund until the court reviewed records and decided if money had been improperly diverted. I signed documents, told Olivia who I'd spoken to and what I had, and she drew up a motion that asked the judge to stop any further disbursements. We set a hearing date and got a provisional order ready. A judge's temporary freeze is a blunt instrument. It doesn't decide guilt, but it stops movement. Olivia explained that service of that order was crucial. Dad needed to be handed the document so the freeze would take effect immediately. We arranged a process server to deliver the order at a scheduled moment, and Olivia made clear the request: seal the motion until service. She told me the administrator of the fund would halt disbursements the instant service occurred if they were informed in advance. I signed an authorization enabling Olivia to contact the fund manager quickly. It felt clinical and cold, the kind of step you take when you no longer trust private conversations. Legal recourse is not dramatic. It's precise and stubborn. Communications architecture had to be tight. I made a list of the people whose decisions mattered if they knew the truth in that room: Robert and Corinne Price, the efficient James Abbott, a few church elders Dad respected, and several of Dad's business partners whose opinions he feared more than anything. I wrote short, factual subject lines, material facts relevant to today's ceremony and financial conduct, and attached 3 documents: the lab result, Rick's notarized statement, and a sealed copy of the court order. The tone was neutral on purpose, for your awareness and necessary decisions. No replies, please. I wanted the documents to be read, not argued about in a chain of emails. I set up the emails on a secure server and scheduled them to release on a single trigger. The trigger was a code I would send from my phone at the moment the server handed Dad the order. Olivia insisted on redundancy, digital and physical, so I printed the packet and put it in a single heavy envelope stamped with the court seal. I paid for overnight courier service to a secured pickup the day before and kept the envelope with me on the drive to the Larkspur. I rehearsed the exact wording of the trigger text, T+0 and a number. One tap and the emails would go out to every address on my list. It was surgical, no leaks, no pauses, just the spread of the same set of documents to people who had to react. Operational logistics for the day were a map of small movements. I walked the venue the day before under the pretext of asking about a guest room rate. I timed exits, noted security desks, and found where a process server could approach without a fuss. I hired Nate Collins, a professional process server who knew how to serve a document quietly and then step back. I told him my instructions in plain language. Approach when Dad took the microphone, hand him the order, wait for his reaction, then retreat. I left nothing to improvisation. The envelope with the printed packet sat in my bag like a stone weight. I chose a black dress so I wouldn't be invisible and so I wouldn't be an invitation. Black reads as intentional, it reads calm. I set my phone to airplane mode except for a single line I kept active for the trigger. I put my phone face down and checked my breathing the way I had practiced box breathing, slow inhale, slow exhale. I wore flats that let me move quickly and a bracelet I could use to tap the phone without drawing attention. I rehearsed the action of placing the envelope on the sweetheart table, of waiting 2 beats, of tapping the phone, of stepping back and letting the rest happen. Each movement was a small choreography. The less it looked like planning, the more it would land. I printed a backup packet and left it with Olivia with instructions. If I didn't hit the code within 3 minutes of Dad speaking, she was to send the emails. I had contingencies if Wi-Fi failed. The server could hand-deliver the court order and the lab report and then call Olivia to release the emails. If Rick recanted in a panic, the notarized copy and chain of custody notes would still stand. I rehearsed responses to patience testing humiliations. If Mom begged me to stop, I would say, "I'm here for truth, not to argue." If Grace collapsed, I would keep distance. Optics mattered. I kept a small, steady rulebook in my head. Reveal only what we could prove, move only when prepared, accept the fallout as consequence, not revenge for its own sake. In the days leading up to the event, I slept poorly but precisely, lining up every element until each had a place on the map. The more I prepared, the calmer I became. The plan was not about spectacle. It was about insistence, about making the family account for what they'd done in front of the people whose opinion counted most to them. I wanted consequences that couldn't be shrugged away over coffee. Evidence, witnesses, and timing were my instruments. I tuned them until I could play the moment cleanly. I rehearsed the micro actions until they felt automatic. How to place an envelope without fidgeting. How to put a phone face down and tap the screen as a single, clean motion. How to step back without looking flustered. I stood in front of a hall mirror and moved like a person carrying out a procedure, no theatrics, only intention. I practiced my face in the mirror until the muscles around my mouth stopped giving away the inside of me. I even practiced laughter I didn't mean to use, the polite little exhale people call a smile, so that if someone tried to bait me into a scene by goading, I could respond with a gentle, controlled deflection that looked calm, not cold. Sleep became part of the regimen. I took melatonin the night before the event and slept with earplugs and a soft mask to block light. I prepared a pre-event ritual. Chamomile tea, a notebook with 2 lines, one for the legal items, one for the emotional scripts, then 10 minutes of breathing before bed. I packed a small bag with spare chargers, a printed copy of the packet, a pen, a plain handkerchief. Everything had a place. Reducing surprises reduced panic. I rehearsed language too, what I would not say as much as what I would say. I wrote the phrase I'd use in the room and repeated it until it felt like a fact rather than a verdict. Please read before you sign anything. I practiced not elaborating. No history, no accusations, no begging for fairness. The preparation was about discipline because discipline is what turns reaction into consequence. It kept me from being the loud person in a room full of witnesses. It let the evidence be the loud thing. I also prepared the people who needed to know. Olivia knew my triggers and my limits. Nate knew timing down to the second. Rick knew there was a paper trail. Each person understood the discipline required. Move when called, be quiet otherwise, follow the plan without improvisation. That web of small, steady actions is what steadied me. In the end, preparation wasn't a shield against feeling. It was the difference between acting from pain and acting with purpose. I built contingencies the way a pilot plans for engine failure. Every likely problem had a coded backup. If the efficient James Abbott decided to ignore the emails and sign the license without reading, Olivia had instructions to file an immediate objection with the county clerk, and she was prepared to issue a quick restraining notice that could be served electronically. If my phone failed at the moment I needed to send the trigger, Olivia had the authority to release the emails at T+3 minutes, which meant 3 minutes after the court order was served. We agreed the delay would be short enough to prevent damage control but long enough to allow a final human check. If Nate was blocked by security, the plan had options. He had a badge I had arranged for him to carry, legitimate-looking, issued by a service I paid for, and a secondary approach path that led through a service entrance. If that failed, Olivia was to call the venue manager to say she had an urgent legal matter for the father of the bride and would deliver documents directly. I knew people liked to avoid legal squabbles in public more than they liked being exposed for potential misdeeds, so pressure would often tilt in my favor. If Rick panicked and tried to recant before the moment, the notarized statement and the lab's chain of custody would still be valid. I kept duplicates of both with Olivia and in my safe deposit box. If Mom begged at the last second to stop because of shame or tears, I rehearsed the words, "I'm here for truth, not to argue," saying it would be sharp but clean. If Grace collapsed emotionally, I had a rule to follow: no physical intervention that could be construed as theatrics. Optics mattered. If she needed help, staff would be summoned. We didn't script her reaction, but we prevented a scene where sympathy would get placed on my side by default. We thought through technological failure too. Emails would be scheduled on 2 servers. The secondary would send automatically if it detected the primary had failed. The printed packet would be handed to a small list of recipients if digital systems hiccuped. There was even a plan for bad weather. The packet's heavy envelope wouldn't get wet because it traveled in a sealed courier bag. I kept a little list in my head: 1. Reveal only provable facts. 2. Let others process. 3. Document everything. That list is how I kept from improvisation. Contingencies are not a sign of paranoia, they're a sign of respect for the plan and the people who must carry it out. I held myself to an ethical line because there are ways to win that cheapen the victory. I refused to fabricate. I refused to bribe witnesses or to manipulate facts. The things I revealed were things that could be verified. I did not create an accusation out of a rumor. I did not plant evidence. The hair and the coffee cup existed. The notarized statement existed. The court order existed. My goal was not humiliation for its own sake, it was consequence for conduct. I limited the audience to those whose decisions would change what happened in that room and with the fund. I informed Robert and Karen Price because their opinion mattered to Evan and thus to Grace. I informed James Abbott because he could stop the license signing. I informed church elders and Dad's partners because reputation is leverage. That selection wasn't spite, it was strategic. You don't need a stadium of witnesses to enforce accountability, you need the right witnesses. I also made a rule about collateral damage. Pain would spread and I accepted that, but I would not cause harm beyond truth. I didn't seek to upend kids' lives or to humiliate people into breakdowns. I wanted financial accountability, an honest record, and a reset to my life. If people suffered as a result, it was a consequence of actions they had chosen over many years, not a goal I celebrated. Ethics anchored me through the worst part of the plan. Each night I vetted my motives. Was I acting for justice or for something uglier? Answering honestly kept me honest. I arrived at the Larkspur 10 minutes early and walked in alone, which felt both exposing and necessary. The ballroom smelled of fresh lilies and the faint tang of seafood on the menu, a mixture of celebration and formality. Heads turned. Whispers rose. I kept my pace steady. I had a space between me and the crowd so I could move without bumping into hands reaching toward me for a last-minute word. I wore a black dress that read as intentional and not mournful, shoes that allowed me to move quickly, and my hair pulled back so I wasn't distracted by my own reflection. I made brief, neutral eye contact with Robert and Karen Price as I passed their table. Their faces registered recognition and something else, a quick calculation. James Abbott saw me and nodded a small acknowledgement. I considered it a quiet pact that he would look for the packet we'd sent. Dad stiffened when he saw me. There are people who operate on a surface level of control, and seeing an unexpected element in a ritual makes them tighten. Grace scanned me like someone scouring code for vulnerability. Her expression was a map of almost everything: offense, calculation, and the faintest hint of curiosity. I kept my face still and walked to my seat. The room's energy is hard to describe unless you've been in one where audience and family collide. A low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the fluting notes of a pianist finishing a piece. People were arranging themselves around expectations. I felt the space as a physical presence, tables like islands, servers moving like tides. I sat, breathed the way I'd practiced, and watched how people organized themselves in reaction to me. The entry is not about a dramatic reveal, it's about the subtle repositioning that signals one person can shift the choreography of many. When the ceremony moved to the signing table, Dad insisted on the speech first, because control likes a script and he had always loved to stage it. He stood, glass raised, the father of the bride pose perfected by years of practice. I saw Nate Collins move from the back of the room with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed his path. He carried the court order like a small tool, not a weapon, and approached with an easy gait that didn't invite spectacle. Dad began in the way he'd always begun: warmth, legacy, a note about family. The room leaned in. As his words reached the phrase family legacy, Nate reached him and quietly extended the envelope with the court seal. He didn't shout. He didn't shove. He simply placed the order into Dad's hand while Dad's speech still flowed. I rose and walked to the sweetheart table with the measured pace I'd practiced. I placed the heavy envelope there, its weight real against the soft linen, and sat down. I tapped my phone once, a single, precise movement. Send now. The emails I had scheduled detonated into inboxes across the room and beyond. I said clearly to the people nearest the signing table, "Please read before you sign anything." The sentence landed like an instruction rather than an accusation. The officiant flipped open the folder he had on his lap, scanned the first page, then the next. Phones began to buzz as subject lines popped up. I watched without speaking as the first reactions unfolded. I felt a soft heat behind my eyes, not anger but the tightness of someone who's done precise work and now watches the machine respond. The lab charts, the percentages, the notes about relatedness, they wavered between dry science and narrative dynamite in those hands. James closed the folder and set it on his knee like a shield. He murmured, "This changes things," and I heard the softness of a man trying not to make the air sharper than it already was. Phones kept buzzing. A woman a table over looked down at her screen, then at me, then back again, like she was reading the first page of a gossip column and finding it was the obituary of a story she thought she knew. Evan's face went raw. He stood up as if to steady himself and then sat again, a small, inward motion that read as withdrawal. Robert, who had been so composed minutes before, was losing the currency he'd banked on, the impression of steadiness. He put his hand on Evan's knee but didn't speak. Grace's mouth opened and closed, the shape of a question that had no script. Dad flipped through the court order like a man checking for a missing page. He mouthed the word freeze without sound, and his shoulders collapsed a degree. The sound of the pianist continued on, thin and brittle, as though trying to hold the room together with notes. The first legal consequence landed like cold rain. James looked up and said carefully, "I cannot sign this license pending clarification of material facts." The sentence was small and crystalline, but in it live consequences nested. Without his signature, the ceremony could not proceed. People began to stand, to move in clusters, their whispering now louder, the hum of the room rising to a new pitch. I didn't gloat. I had never wanted a spectacle. I wanted a clarity that would make the family account for itself. Watching James close the book on the signing felt like watching a valve close. Momentum stopped. Dad hissed something about timing and decency, a low sound meant for those who already agreed with him. Nate stood near him, unflinching, a little man with a document, doing a job that required steadiness more than temperament. Dad tried to wave the legal packet away, then realized the seal meant the judge had touched it and his hand had to hold the consequences. He swiveled his gaze to the prices where earlier he had expected applause. He found cool caution. He barked, low and furious, at Nate to get out of here, and Nate simply put his hands in his pockets and turned away. Grace demanded to know if the DNA was fake. She said it loud enough to reach tables 3 and 4. Her voice had an edge that was half accusation and half pleading. I said only, "The lab will answer that question." I didn't shout. I didn't throw her words back. I let the documents and the people with authority do the talking. Evan took a step back from her as if physical proximity had become risk. His parents shared a look that carried more calculation than comfort. Uncle Rick's face was pale and he didn't speak for a long time, then he slid out of his chair and left the room without a word. Watching him go felt like seeing a hinge come off a long-held secret. Mom reached for me with a look I recognized as contrition and terror, a look that asked for rescue in a way her voice never had. She mouthed my name like a child's prayer, but I didn't move. My place in that moment was not to bind the wound with bandage and denial. My place was to set the matter down so others could see it clearly. I spoke once more at table level, my voice low but carrying enough to reach those nearest me. "Please read before you sign anything," I said. That sentence was not an instruction to ruin a wedding. It was a procedural request, one I wished had been granted to me when others made decisions for me. I left the packet where it lay on the sweetheart table and stood. People edged around me as if I were a newly exposed point on a map. I walked out with the same measured step I had come in with, the room shrinking around me into a series of faces lit by the glow of screens. The immediate aftermath looked like a tableau of disorientation. James filed an incident note and stepped away, his professional tone carefully neutral. The venue manager put the reception on pause and asked the planner to hold deliveries. Vendors were called by the hotel's events team and told to delay everything: linen trucks, dessert deliveries, last-minute floral inserts. The Larkspur's kitchen manager kept staff on standby and instructed servers to clear the room gently. They moved with a practiced hush that felt almost reverent. Guests began to drift toward exits with their phones out, whispering into screens, replaying words they'd heard. Robert and Karen Price briskly escorted Evan and Grace to a private room at the back of the ballroom. Voices rose and stopped. There were moments when a sentence would start and fold back in on itself, the way conversations do when all of the people in them are trying to find footing. Dad, surrounded by his old allies, took his phone and began making calls. The calls were brief, sharp: legal counsel, business partners, someone to confirm a story. He could no longer control the narrative the way he had planned. Instead, he was spinning to hold it. Olivia filed for a full accounting within 48 hours. The court ordered records of the funds, disbursements, and transfers be produced within 10 days. The immediate freeze on remaining assets meant that any further money he tried to move out of the fund hit a wall. Bank administrators flagged transactions, requests were denied, and the $20,000 figure he had named to correct course became a nominal promise with no practical effect. The fund administrator found irregular transfers, payments routed oddly, withdrawals made with explanations that didn't align to a beneficiary's educational expenses. Those anomalies had been quiet for years, now they were loud. The freeze meant vendors suspended work until contracts and payments were clarified. Olivia drafted a request to the court to compel a forensic accountant to trace transfers back 3 years. That motion had teeth. Accountants would be in Dad's ledgers with magnifying glasses and questions. I authorized the release of selected records to the fund's other beneficiaries and past administrators so there'd be multiple eyes on the paperwork. That act was about transparency. If funds had been diverted, other people had a right to know. Dad called these moves betrayal. He called me ungrateful and public. He called his partners to explain, and some of them, pragmatic and protective of their own stakes, began to ask questions. Church elders who'd once toasted him delayed honoring him. A board review was requested by his partners, an inquiry into whether his leadership had exposed them to reputational risk. In private, some people told Olivia they admired my composure. In public, they asked no questions. The legal mechanisms I'd set in motion had one effect I had underappreciated until it happened. They reduced a man's ability to spin. Family truths don't go back in the box once they've been opened in front of people who matter. Rick admitted paternity to Mom in a raw and private conversation a day after the event. She called me later that night and confessed in a voice that sounded older than her years. She told me things I'd suspected, things that fit into the ledger I'd kept. Early favors Rick had offered, Grace, secret notes, flights to recitals that didn't line up with Dad's memory. Mom's confession was not a redemption story. It was an accounting of choices made out of fear and habit. Rick then told Dad privately. That conversation was explosive, not in the way of shouting but in the way of two men realizing they had been carrying a narrative that had become a liability. Dad's denial had softened into procedural defense. How do we explain this? And that question is what became evidence he couldn't avoid. Grace cycled through stages. Anger at being exposed, denial that the papers meant anything, and then panic as Evan and his parents reconsidered plans. She sent a terse message to the family group, privacy, please, and turned off comments. Her social media went dark, extended family divided. Some siblings and cousins reached out to me with cautious messages that sounded like apologies. Others took up Dad's mantle of outrage and called the whole thing a vendetta. The ones who had watched me quietly and never intervened now offered soft support. People who had ignored my name in conversations started using it with a different tone, one that acknowledged presence rather than assumed absence. I didn't rush to collect those who had failed me. I set terms. No family meetings without an agenda and counsel present, no attempts at private reconciliation that weren't documented and actionable. I sent one message to the family group with the clarity I'd kept for the courtroom: do not contact me without counsel present about legal issues. I meant it. I needed boundaries that had force. The events forced a recalibration of relationships. Some ties frayed beyond repair, some quietly realigned. The house that had always placed optics above truth had to live with people who now had access to documents that contradicted the image they'd long sold. That contradiction is messy, ongoing, and not something that unravels with apologies. It requires accounting, time, and a willingness to accept consequences. I was ready for that work. Evan paused the engagement. Without James's signature, there was no license. No amount of dinner table convincing would make the legal form appear. I watched Grace live through the collapse of narrative she'd expected to inherit. She posted a vague line about privacy and closed comments, the kind of curated retreat people use when reality isn't giving them the script they rehearsed. Some relatives reached out with cautious texts that read like first drafts of sympathy. Others answered with outrage and rallied to Dad's defense. A few people I hardly knew sent messages that said simply, "We believe you." Those messages landed like unexpected gifts. Professionally, people who'd once overlooked me began to address me with a small, immediate respect. Colleagues who used my first name now added a question about what I wanted to do next. A client contacted me to say they'd been impressed by how calmly I'd handled a public crisis. They asked if I'd consider leading a project that required exacting organization. The recalibration felt practical. My name moved from a margin to a line item on people's mental spreadsheets. It didn't erase the past, it just changed the map. I set a new baseline for my life and kept it simple. I moved apartments, changed locks, and put extra privacy settings on accounts. I updated beneficiaries and checked titles, small administrative acts that felt like closing windows and drawing curtains. I kept therapy weekly but shifted the work from shock processing to architecture. What next? What's sustainable? What feels like care rather than duty? I met with a financial planner Olivia recommended and started transferring accounts into places my father could not touch. That process felt like reclaiming my future in pencil and ink. I deleted the old wedding files and made a new folder called Boundaries, Enforced. In that folder were passwords, a list of contacts who could not call me without counsel present, and documents showing who owed what. I started saying no on a different schedule. I accepted invitations that felt reciprocal and declined others politely but firmly. I stopped rescuing the household's image and started allocating time to projects and people who gave as much as they received. I didn't reconcile on anyone else's timeline. I offered conversations with structure, agenda, counsel if needed, and real consequences attached. That stance thinned the field. Some people disappeared, others stepped into accountability. I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb more often and scheduled blocks of work and rest that were non-negotiable. Silence became my tool. When people expected me to shrink again, I remained quiet and let the record do the talking. That stillness felt like power, not erasure, but selection. I choose when to speak, who hears me, and when a door remains closed. If you've been sidelined by your own family, tell me what you'd have done. Share your story in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more first-person revenge stories. I read every word.